Thank you, sir. I've always been fascinated by two things: stories and problems. Well, everybody loves stories, and we are all connected by a universal need to hear stories, to understand ourselves. So it's little wonder I love them too. But the reason I'm so fascinated by problems is a bit harder to understand. The best way I know how to explain it is by quoting Albert Einstein, when he said, "The formulation of the problem is often more essential than its solution." Einstein should have also said that if he had 1 hour to save the world, he would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes solving it. So the reason I'm fascinated by problems is because we first need to define the problem before we are in a position to actually solve it, which is what I'm really interested in, solving people's problems. And that's why today I'm going to talk to you about how to solve problems by telling stories. The best way to actually start this is by telling you a little story. So let's just jump right into it. Imagine a guy on the couch. He's thirsty. He gets up off his couch. He walks into the kitchen, searches through the refrigerator. He finds a soda. He drinks it, returns to his couch, first satisfied. Well, it's probably not the most exciting story in the world, but Dan Harmon, the co-creator of the animated series Rick and Morty, uses it to describe the 8 steps to which he says all stories can be distilled to. But before we continue, can you just please give me a quick show of hands if any one of you has ever heard the term hero's journey or monomyth before? So there are quite a few people. It's good. It's just I'm really interested in all of this, and so I'm going to tell you about it a little bit. And Wikipedia says that the hero's journey is the ultimate narrative archetype. It is the story behind the story, and it has the same form across all different myths, cultures, religion, and everything. And it's this one single human quest that we all have in common across all different cultures. And it's the one great story of mankind. As Joseph Campbell says in his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And just to be clear about this, Joseph Campbell didn't invent the hero's journey. What he did is he studied myths across all over the world, just to realize that whenever we humans tell a story, we always use the same basic structure, which is the hero's journey. And the reason I'm telling you this is to introduce the 8 steps that Dan Harmon uses to write all of his stories based on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Think of them as a tool for storytelling and a summary of the hero's journey. So here we go. The 8 steps are as following. 1. A character is on the zone of comfort. 2. But they want something. 3. They enter an unfamiliar situation. They adapt to it. They get what they wanted. They pay a heavy price for it. Then they return to where they started and are now capable of change. Or even shorter, you need, go, search, find, take, return, change. So let's now just have a quick look at our first story and how it fits into these 8 steps. So 1, there's a man on a couch. 2, he's thirsty. 3, he gets up off the couch and goes to his kitchen. He searches through his refrigerator, he finds a soda, he drinks it, then returns to his couch, first satisfied. So now that you've seen just how easy it is to tell stories and how natural it actually is for us humans, I think it's time to move on to the next part where we're going to talk about how telling stories can help us solve problems. About 10 years ago, my colleagues Andreas, Markus, Matthias, and I started a company called Simplice. Simplice is a user experience design consultancy, and we work with enterprises and startups to create meaningful and easy-to-use digital products. And the way we do this is we listen to people's stories to understand their problems, and then we tell our own stories to solve them. We start by just talking to our clients and then having interviews with their users or potential users, just to find out what problems people are really having when they're using a certain product or when they find themselves in a certain situation. Throughout these interviews, or let's maybe first start with how we begin these interviews, because it's actually a pretty simple thing, because we just ask people, well, can you just describe to me a typical day in your life? Or we ask them, well, just tell me what you did yesterday. Just anything to get them to open up and to tell us their stories. And once we get them to open up and they talk to us, what we do is we listen very attentively to every word they're saying. And we encourage them by saying things like, that's really interesting, or okay, and why are you doing this? Or just, and what are you doing next? While we carefully shift the conversation to the topics we're really interested in, which could be, I don't know, how people are handling their finances if we are hired to design an online banking service, or how they buy shoes if it's our job to design an online store. Throughout these interviews, we try to cultivate a beginner's mind as much as possible, which means which means actually that we're not jumping to conclusions right away, which is tempting sometimes, because you hear something and you try to jump to a conclusion, but the beginner's mind for us really means not jumping to conclusions right away, and instead just keep listening and trying to learn as much as we possibly can. An interview can take about half an hour or even longer, because we really want to find out about these people. We want to understand their goals, their motivations, their frustrations, and of course, their problem. So what we do is we're listening to people, because we're listening to people telling their stories, because storytelling is the most natural way for humans to communicate. And since every story automatically is about someone experiencing a problem and how they overcome it, which is the hero's journey identified by Joseph Campbell, all we really need to do is listening to people telling their stories, and suddenly we understand their problems. And once we understand people's problems, we are in a very good position to actually solve them. But first, in the words of Albert Einstein, let's move back and spend some more time defining the problem before we actually move on to solve them. The way we do this is by writing something called a persona, to summarize all the different people, all the different behavior patterns that we've identified in these interviews. Persona is basically a name, an age, a gender, a photo, or whatever other information we need to create a believable character. The whole process is a bit more complex than that, but basically what we do is that we draft a story for each persona to describe the problems people are currently experiencing. The purpose of these personas is to get an understanding of their problems and to share it within the whole team so that everyone can read it, understand it, and keep them in mind. Just one quick story to illustrate that. We were once at a conference, not unlike this, and a client of us was on the stage, and he was actually talking about personas too. And at one point he says, their company is using personas too. And whenever he meets a new potential customer or client, he asks himself just one simple question. The question is this person more of a Michael or a Thomas? Which happened to be the two personas we just created for them a couple of years earlier. And that's the power of stories. Because not only do they help you understand people's behavior, their motivations, their goals, their frustrations, and of course their problems, but they stay with you for years. And there's another advantage, which is that finally, everyone in a project team is on the same page and they all understand which problems we're really trying to solve. And once we know which problem we're trying to solve, because we've described them in our persona story, we move on to tell another kind of story. This one's called a scenario. A scenario is a textual description of a persona's interaction with the future product. It's It's like a scenario, every scenario begins just by describing a certain situation. And you describe how this persona is going to solve his or her problems by using this product. They are high-level and optimistic stories describing an ideal interaction. And you can think of them as something like a screenplay for a movie, because they ensure that the finished product makes sense to the audience. Okay, and importantly, they inspire us to come up with ideas and solutions that we would never get without storytelling. And once we all agreed that our scenarios make sense and that we are actually solving people's problems with this, then we can move on and define product requirements based on these scenarios. And from there on, we can move on and make sketches of how possible solutions could look like, and start with the whole design process by creating prototypes of our solutions and testing them with real people to find out if our proposed solutions really work. It's actually a very straightforward process, and it's always astonishing to see just how obvious a solution becomes once it's well defined in a comprehensible story. Okay, so these TED Talks are about ideas worth spreading. And there's one idea in particular that I find worth being spread, and so I want to dedicate the third part of my presentation to this idea. And I'm going to talk to you about it by telling you another story. This one is actually my favorite story, because it's the ultimate story, our human story. And this little story is so powerful, it would actually solve every problem in the world. So let's go. Imagine a stork. We'll call him Adam. Every summer, Adam migrates north with the other storks to breed. And since he doesn't have a conscious mind, he doesn't think about or question his behavior. He's just following what his instincts tell him to do. But what happens if we give Adam a large brain, capable of conscious thought? Well, he will start to think for himself. But many of his new ideas will not be consistent with his instincts. For instance, while migrating north, Adam spots an island full of apple trees, and he makes the conscious decision to divert from his migratory flight path and fly down to explore the island. It's his first grand experiment in self-management, self-exploration. But the moment his instincts realize that Adam strayed from his instinctive flight course, they start to criticize him. They start to criticize him for his deprogrammed behavior. And they try to dogmatically pull him back to his original flight path. And so they try to pull him back. And imagine, in this situation, what's happening. The problem is, his instincts have no idea that Adam has to search for knowledge. But his conscious mind requires understanding through experimentation. So inevitably, a war will break out between his instincts and his intellect. Ideally, at this point, Adam's conscious mind would sit down and talk to his instincts and tell him why he's defying them. He would explain that the gene-based natural selection process gives species instinctive orientations to the world, whereas his conscious mind needs an understanding of the world to operate. His conscious mind is capable of understanding cause and effect. But Adam doesn't have this understanding yet. He's just begun his search for knowledge. So the only thing is, he doesn't even know what the problem is, because the only thing that really happened is he started to feel bad and even evil. So tragically, 3 things unavoidably happened while you search for knowledge. 1, Adam defiantly or defensively retaliates against the criticism. He tries to deny it and block it out. And he will seek any kind of reinforcement to relieve himself from the negative feelings. So he becomes angry, alienated, and egocentric, a psychological upset state. Becoming psychologically upset is the price Adam Stork had to pay for his heroic search for knowledge. In the words of the song The Impossible Dream from the musical Man of La Mancha, Adam had to be prepared to march into hell for a heavenly cause. He had to lose himself to find himself. He had to suffer upset by becoming angry, alienated, and egocentric. And that's why Adam Stork is a hero. Because surely the conscious mind is nature's greatest invention, and being given the task to search for understanding while the whole world's condemning you is the hardest and toughest of tasks, because that condemnation was universal. All the other innocent storks, they condemn the search for knowledge. And since all of nature, the rain, the clouds, the trees, other animals, are all associated with Adam's instinctive self, in effect the whole world ganged up on Adam. And yet he was good all along, but he couldn't explain why. But now, at last, he can. This is a short little story written by Australian biologist Jeremy Griffith, presented in his 2016 book, Freedom, The End of the Human Condition. Jeremy uses this metaphor to truthfully explain and solve the biggest of all problems, the human condition. It is the underlying core issue in all of human affairs. It is the elephant of elephant in our living rooms. The one problem no one ever talks about, and yet the one thing we needed to address and solve to finally be able to stop all the suffering and conflict on this planet. We can finally understand ourselves and know through first principle-based scientific explanation that we humans are all fundamentally good. And not just good, we turn out to be the absolute heroes of the story of life on Earth. This is all so exciting. The whole human story, everything, and the explanation that Jeremy is providing, this instinct versus intellect explanation. But I will leave it to you and your beginner's mind to explore it for yourself. All I want to do now, to finish all this up, is to see how Adam Stork's story fits into our 8 steps mentioned earlier. So let's begin. 1. Adam Stork, that is, us humans. We needed to find understanding. And that's why we left our instinctive orientation to search for knowledge. Then we find knowledge, and we pay a heavy price for it by becoming psychologically upset until we find the key knowledge, which is understanding of the human condition, because then we can return to where we started, and this changes everything, because it ends the underlying conflict within us, and thus solves all the problem in the world. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I just want to leave you with a quote by American poet T.S. Eliot, because it has been my favorite quote for many years, and I think it summarizes humanity's journey, heroic journey, from ignorance to enlightenment just perfectly. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Thank you.